Montana Territory. Early spring of 1878, the wind howled through the Bitterroot Valley, kicking up dust as Juliana Carter slammed the saloon doors open with a voice bigger than the mountains behind her. "I said I will sing one more, and if you do not like it, you can go drink somewhere else," she shouted, hands on her hips, cheeks flushed with fury. The piano player froze mid-chord. A few cowhands at the back chuckled into their whiskey. The man she was shouting at muttered something and stumbled out, too drunk to argue. Juliana turned toward the crowd, her chest rising with pride. "Now then." "Where were we?" She gave the piano man a nod, swept her skirts aside, and started up a tune that filled the whole room, rich and powerful and alive. They had always told her she was too loud to love. Too much voice, too much heart, too many opinions for a woman. But she had 2 children to raise and no time to be quiet. After the last note, she stepped off the little stage and made her way toward the back, where her children waited behind the swinging kitchen doors. Grace, 10, was braiding her little brother's hair. Gideon, 7, grinned up at his mother like she had just roped the moon. "You were too loud again," Grace whispered, trying to sound stern. Juliana dropped to her knees and kissed both their foreheads. "And you loved every second of it. They were all she had." Her husband had left the year before, skipped town with some traveling trader and a sack full of their coin. He had not looked back. Juliana had not wasted a tear on him. Out front, the saloon had quieted some. A few regulars lingered for another drink. Then the door opened again and in walked a stranger, tall, dusty, quiet. He had a rifle strapped across his back and a tired look in his eyes, like he had been chasing something for too long. Juliana saw him from the kitchen and tilted her head. "You lost?" she asked, stepping back into the room. The man looked up, his voice low but clear. "No, ma'am, just thirsty." She poured him a drink herself. He watched her with quiet eyes that did not flinch when she laughed too loud or moved too quick. She noticed that. "You knew in town." "Just passing through," he said. "Name's Hayes Gallagher." "Juliana Carter," she said, offering her hand. "You look like a man who has been riding a long time." "I look like that because I have been riding a long time." She laughed, loud again, and he smiled, small but true. That night, after the children were asleep in the back room and the saloon had emptied, Hayes stayed behind. He nursed his drink slow, eyes on the fire. "You sing like you mean it," he said. "I do." "That a problem?" He shook his head. "Not at all. It's rare." Juliana sat across from him, folding her hands on the table. "People tell me I am too loud, too much, especially for a woman who has been left behind." "People say a lot of things," Hayes replied. "Most of them do not matter." She looked at him for a long while. Then softly, "You speak less than anyone I have met, but it all seems to count." He reached into his coat and pulled out a folded piece of paper, laid it on the table like it was heavy. "I am tracking a man," he said. "My younger brother. He ran with a bad crowd down near the Colorado line. He wrote me once, said he was sorry for what he had done. I am trying to find him before someone less forgiving does." Juliana leaned forward. "You think he came through here?" Hayes nodded. "He might have. I am not sure yet." She studied his face. "You are not just chasing him. You are trying to save him." He looked down at his hands. "Maybe." She did not press. Instead, she stood and took his empty glass. "You can sleep in the loft if you need a place. No charge." Hayes lifted his eyes. "Why?" "Because you do not flinch when I laugh." The next morning, Juliana woke to the sound of something crashing outside. She rushed out and found Gideon cornered by one of the local rancher's sons, a boy nearly twice his size. Hayes was already there, stepping between them. "Back off," he said calmly but with steel in his voice. The boy scoffed and ran off without another word. Juliana pulled Gideon close. "You all right?" He nodded, wide-eyed. "He just called Mama names." Hayes looked at Juliana. That happen often. Only when someone drinks too early, she said, brushing Gideon's hair back. Hayes crouched next to the boy. You did right, standing your ground. Gideon beamed. You think so, I know so. From that day on, Hayes stayed. He took to helping around the saloon, fixing things that had gone years without repair. He mended the steps, patched the roof, even taught Gideon how to carve wooden animals. The boy followed him like a shadow. Juliana watched it all from the porch one evening, arms crossed, a strange warmth settling in her chest. You do not talk much, she said as Hayes joined her. He leaned against the rail. But I listen. She looked over at her children playing in the dirt. They like you. I like them, she looked at him. You like me, he met her eyes. You ever quiet down? No, good, I miss the noise when you are not around. She blinked, her heart skipping. That's supposed to be sweet, he nodded. It is. That night after the children were asleep, Juliana sat beside Hayes near the fire. The silence between them was soft, not empty. She looked over at him, her eyes shining. You really not bothered by me, by all this? He looked at her long and true. They told you that you were too loud to love. They were wrong. She swallowed hard. You sure? He took her hand. I never been more sure of anything. And for the first time in years, Juliana let someone hold her hand without pulling away. She did not say thank you. She just leaned her head against his shoulder, and they sat like that until the fire burned low. The spring rains came late that year, soaking the valley in slow, steady sheets that turned the roads to mud and set the cottonwoods to greening. Hayes had taken to stacking wood behind the saloon early each morning, his coat already damp by the time Juliana opened the kitchen door with her sleeves rolled and her hair braided back tight. You're going to ruin those boots, she said, brushing rain off her forearm with the back of her hand. They've been through worse, he replied, straightening with an armful of dry logs. You need anything from the general store. Juliana hesitated, then nodded. Thread, and that peppermint oil Grace likes. She's been waking with headaches. Hayes gave a single nod and set off down the muddy main road. Juliana watched him go, the collar of his coat turned up against the drizzle. She didn't say it aloud, but she'd come to rely on him being around before the sun was fully up. There was a steadiness in it she hadn't known she was missing. Inside, Grace sat at the table with a book open, her brow furrowed. Gideon was on the floor, drawing a wagon in the dirt that had drifted in on someone's boots. You're wasting time, Grace said, not looking up. That wagon doesn't even have reins. Gideon didn't answer. He just kept scraping the shape of a horse with a stick. Juliana stepped between them. Grace, let him be, and close that book for now. I need help peeling potatoes. The girl sighed but obeyed, sliding off the bench and joining her mother at the basin. After a moment, she asked, Is Mr. Gallagher staying through the summer? Juliana kept her gaze on the peeler in her hand. I don't know. I hope he does, Grace said simply. That afternoon, Hayes returned with his coat dripping and a small parcel tucked under his arm. He handed the peppermint oil to Grace without a word and left the thread on the counter. Then he reached into his coat again and pulled out a folded piece of canvas. For Gideon, he said. The boy looked up from the floor, wide-eyed. What is it? Hayes crouched and unrolled the canvas to reveal a set of small carving knives and 2 blocks of pine. Figured you might want to try something finer than a kitchen spoon. Juliana leaned against the doorframe, silent. Gideon reached out reverently. Is this real? It's yours now. Grace peered over her brother's shoulder. You didn't have to do that. I know. Juliana didn't speak until the children had gone out back to test the new tools under the eaves. Her voice was low. You didn't buy that just to be kind. No, Hayes said. I bought it because I see something in him, and because I never had anyone teach me much when I was his age. She watched him a moment. "You ever want your own?" He looked out the window. "Didn't think I'd be the sort." "Now I'm not so sure." That night, thunder rolled over the mountains and lightning cracked low across the sky. Gideon crept out of his room and curled against Juliana's side in the bed, his small body trembling. She held him close until he stilled. The next morning, the storm gone, Hayes met her in the quiet of the porch while the children still slept. "You warm enough last night?" she asked. "I've slept colder," he said. She studied him, the way his eyes always seemed to take in the edges of things before settling on the center. "You ever stop moving, Hayes?" He took his time answering. "Not since the war." Was it bad? All of it was bad. She didn't ask more. Instead, she stepped closer and reached up to brush a bit of bark dust from his shoulder. "You live like a man who's waiting for something to give him permission to stay." He met her eyes. "Maybe I was." She didn't move her hand from where it rested on his arm. "You don't have to keep chasing ghosts, not if you don't want to." Hayes looked down at her hand, then back up. "I'm not sure I know how to stop." "Then maybe you need someone loud enough to show you." He didn't smile, but his eyes softened. "I miss the noise when you're not talking." Juliana felt her heart catch, but she didn't look away. "They told me I was too loud to love. They were wrong." Hayes reached up and tucked a damp strand of hair behind her ear, his fingers rough but careful. She didn't pull away. Inside, the floor creaked as Grace stirred. The moment passed, but it didn't vanish. Later that day, a rider came through town, flinging mud from his horse's hooves as he reined in hard outside the blacksmith's. Hayes was splitting kindling near the stable and glanced up. The rider's coat was worn thin and his eyes were wary. He asked for water and Hayes brought him some. The man drank deep, then looked at him longer than necessary. "You Gallagher's brother?" he asked. Hayes's hand stilled. "You know him. Passed through Sheridan last month, headed west, said he was looking for a clean start." Hayes nodded slowly. "You see if he was alone, not when he left." "Had a woman with him, and a child." The man tipped his hat and rode on. That night, Hayes sat outside long after the lamps were out, staring into the dark. Juliana came out with a shawl around her shoulders and sat beside him. "You heard about your brother?" He nodded. "You going?" "I don't know yet." She didn't press. She just rested her hand on his knee. He didn't speak again, but he stayed close to her the whole night. When the sun rose, it found them still there, shoulder to shoulder, not saying a word. The morning after the rider passed through, the skies over the valley turned a soft pewter, and the scent of wet sage drifted in from the hills. Hayes stood beside the woodpile, running his thumb along the grain of a plank he hadn't yet split. His hat shaded his brow, but his eyes tracked the movement of Juliana as she stepped out with a basket of linens for the line. She didn't look at him right away, but when she did, she didn't say anything about the way his boots were pointed toward the trail west. He crossed the yard slow, not hurrying his steps. She was pinning a damp sheet to the line, fingers red from the cold water. "You think you'll find him?" she asked, her voice low. "I don't know." Hayes's shoulders shifted beneath his shirt. "He's running from the same things I did." "I'm not sure he wants to be found." Juliana slid another clothespin into place. "You think that makes him past saving?" Hayes took the last square of linen from the basket without asking and reached up to help. "No, but it means he has to want peace." Juliana's hand stilled. "And you?" "You still want it." He met her eyes. "I'm closer to it than I've ever been." She didn't answer right away, just moved to the next line. The wind pulled at her braid, and when she turned again, her eyes had gone soft around the edges. "You'd leave without saying goodbye." "I wouldn't leave like that," he said. "If I go, you'll know why." Juliana nodded once and stepped past him, her skirt brushing against his leg. "Then I'll leave the lantern burning, in case you need the way back." That evening, a girl from the edge of the valley arrived, pale and thin, her arm wrapped in a bloodied cloth. She'd ridden hard from her father's homestead after a wagon wheel shattered and caught her beneath it. Juliana rushed her into the kitchen, calling for warm water, and Hayes was already setting the stove to boil before she finished the sentence. Grace hovered near the door, uncertain, while Gideon fetched the clean rags without being asked. Hayes held the girl's wrist steady as Juliana cleaned the wound. The girl whimpered once, but Juliana's voice went low and steady. "Breathe through it. That's it. You're not alone here." The girl blinked at her through tears and nodded. Afterward, when the girl was resting on a cot in the storeroom, Juliana stepped out onto the porch. Hayes followed, wiping his hands on a clean rag. "You've done that before," he said. Juliana leaned against the railing, the breeze tugging at her sleeves. "My mother was a midwife. She taught me before she passed. Said a woman who can stop bleeding and boil a good broth would never starve." Hayes sat beside her on the stoop. "You ever think of doing it for more than just folks who stumble in?" She looked out toward the hills. "I used to, before the children. Before everything shifted. Now I do what I can when I can." He watched her a while before speaking again. "You still want more?" Juliana turned her head slowly. "You asking if I want to start dreaming again. I'm asking if you ever stopped." She didn't answer with words. Instead, she looked at him long and full, as if weighing every mile he'd ridden against the weight of her own waiting. Later that week, news came from a trader that Hayes's brother had taken work near Butte, hauling freight. He was still alive, still trying. Hayes read the letter twice, then folded it without comment. Juliana found him behind the saloon, sitting on a stump, the paper beside him. "You going to him?" "I don't know what I'd say when I got there," Hayes murmured. "I don't know if he'd listen." Juliana stepped beside him, arms crossed. "Then don't go for the words. Go so he sees you didn't give up." He looked up at her. "And if I go, what do I leave behind?" She crouched down and laid her hand on his knee. "Not everything's waiting to be left, Hayes. Some things stay. Some things grow." He reached out and touched her chin, just enough to draw her eyes to his. "If I go, I'll come back." "You better," she said, steady. "Because I'm not finished teaching you how to sit still." He grinned, and it was the first time she'd seen it reach all the way to his eyes. The next morning, before dawn, he packed a saddlebag and left Grace with a folded note for her mother. He rode out while the dew still clung to the grass, his silhouette cutting clean against the pale sky. Juliana read the note once, then folded it and tucked it into her apron. She didn't cry. Instead, she poured the coffee, got the children dressed, and by noon was tending to the girl in the back room as if nothing in the world had changed. But every night, after the children were asleep, she stepped out and lit the lantern on the porch. And every night, she waited a little longer before putting it out. Hayes returned in late August, when the fields were gold at the edges and the wind carried the scent of ripe chokecherries. Morning light had just broken over the mountains when his horse crested the ridge above town, his figure leaner than before, shoulders still square beneath the dust of travel. Juliana was on her knees in the garden behind the saloon, coaxing late summer carrots from the soil. She didn't hear the hoofbeats at first, not until Grace shouted from the porch. She straightened slowly, dirt clinging to her palms. Her breath caught when she saw him, reins in one hand, the other resting easy against his thigh. His gaze found hers across the yard, steady and unhurried, like no time had passed at all. "You come back for more kindling," she said, brushing soil from her skirt as she walked toward him. He dismounted without a word, and when his boots touched earth, the moment folded in around them like a blanket pulled tight. "I said I would," Hayes said. "Didn't plan on arriving before the frost, but I made it." Juliana's hands itched to reach for him, but she kept them still. "You find what you were after," I found him. He's working in a freight company near Missoula. Got a woman now. Boy with her might be his, might not. His voice was even, but there was something settled in it that hadn't been there before. He didn't ask me to stay, and I didn't ask him to change. She nodded once. That sounds like peace. More than I thought I'd get, Hayes replied. He's not my burden anymore. Juliana stepped forward, close enough to see the road wearing his face. And now he glanced toward the saloon. Now I reckon I'd like to build something that stays put. Grace stood in the doorway, arms crossed, trying to look unimpressed. You left your carving knife here, she called. Gideon's been using it for everything but carving. Hayes chuckled low in his chest. Then I better earn it back. Inside, the saloon had changed in small, quiet ways. The warped floorboards near the hearth had been replaced. A second shelf had been added above the bar, filled with dried herbs tied in neat bundles. The girl they'd taken in during the spring had moved on weeks ago, but her cot remained folded in the corner, just in case. Juliana poured Hayes a cup of chicory and sat across from him at the kitchen table. The children were outside, chasing shadows beneath the eaves. You thinking of staying under my roof? He shook his head. I was thinking of building one next to it, if that's something you'd allow. She leaned back in her chair, arms folded. You offering something permanent or just a place to keep your saddle dry? Hayes met her gaze without flinching. I'm offering what I've got left. A strong back, 2 steady hands, and a heart that don't wander anymore. Juliana's throat tightened, but she held his eyes. You sure you want a woman who sings too loud and talks too much? I told you once, he said, voice low. I miss the noise when you're not talking. She rose then, came around the table, and stood before him. Then you better get used to it, because I don't plan on going quiet. Hayes stood too slow and deliberate, his hands brushing against hers. Good. I've had enough silence to last 2 lifetimes. Outside, the wind tugged at the curtains. Inside, they stood close, not needing to say more. That fall, Hayes took work at the livery, and every morning began with the thump of his boots on the porch and the smell of coffee already brewing. Gideon followed him from one post to the next, learning how to split fence rails and oil harnesses. Grace started helping Juliana with her herbs, learning the difference between tansy and yarrow, and how to ease a fever without frightening a child. By November, Hayes had cleared a patch of land just past the saloon's back lot. He built the frame of the house with his own hands, and though it was simple, 1 room, a lean-to for his tools, a porch wide enough for 2 chairs, it stood straight against the coming snow. One evening, as the first flurries drifted from the sky, Juliana walked out to find him hanging a lantern on the new porch beam. She stopped beside him, her scarf pulled tight around her neck. You build this for yourself? She asked. He turned slightly, his hand still on the lantern. No. Built it for the ones who made me want to stop running. Juliana looked up at the glass, its flicker soft and steady. You're sure? I'm sure, he said. I want a life where your laugh fills the whole room. I want to wake up with your hand near mine. She stepped forward and pressed her palm to his chest. Then you better come in before the coffee goes cold. That winter, the valley lay quiet under snow, and the saloon filled with warmth of kind voices, of laughter, of a home built not from timber, but from choosing each other every day. And when spring came again, the lantern still hung on that porch beam, though Hayes no longer needed it to find his way home. By late March of the following year, the soil had begun to soften beneath the frost, and the cottonwoods along the creek showed their first pale buds. The long freeze had broken gently, and with it, life stirred again in the Bitterroot Valley. Hayes had spent the last few weeks hauling stone from the hillside to edge the greenhouse Juliana had spoken of building since the autumn. She had drawn the plans herself on a scrap of flour sack with the charcoal she used for kindling, her handwriting neat, steady, and sure. That morning, she stood barefoot in the garden patch, pressing her heel into the thawed earth. Hayes watched from the porch, a cup of broth in his hands, steam curling upward. She turned to look at him, her hair braided back in a crown, sleeves rolled past the elbow, and a faint streak of dirt across her cheek. "You think it's too soon to start the tomatoes?" she asked. "You think I'd argue with you about soil," he said, stepping down into the yard. "You've got more sense in your palms than I've got in both boots." She tilted her head, considering. "Then get the shovel. If we're wrong, we'll be wrong together." They worked side by side through the morning. Hayes dug the trenches, and Juliana laid the seeds with a tenderness that reminded him how she handled every living thing, children, strangers, even herself, when no one was watching. Grace brought out water in the tin pail they used for laundry, while Gideon sorted the seed packets by hand, naming each aloud as though they were old friends. In the quiet between chores, Hayes paused and leaned his weight on the shovel. "You ever think about adding to what we've got?" "You mean chickens?" Juliana asked, not looking up. "I mean more of us." She sat back on her heels, brushing the dirt from her hands. "You asking if I want another child? I'm asking what you'd want if the world owed you nothing and gave you everything." Juliana stood, brushing her skirt down. "Then yes, I'd want another. I'd want a whole table full. But only if it's with a man who doesn't mind their mother being loud." He stepped forward, catching her hand. "Then we'll see what comes. But I'd build a table twice as long if it meant you at one end and me at the other." That night, the four of them sat around the fire, the children playing with carved animals Hayes had shaped from pine. Grace had started sketching new ones in the margins of her school primer, and Juliana had begun teaching her the names of healing plants in both English and the Salish words her mother had remembered from childhood. When the children were asleep, Hayes and Juliana sat on their porch, the lantern casting a warm glow across the floorboards. She brought out a small tin box and handed it to him without saying anything. Inside was a folded piece of cloth, soft blue, stitched with two initials, J and H, joined in a pattern of ivy threads. "I made it when the snow came," she said. "Didn't know if you'd still want it." He ran his fingers over the stitches. "You made something for me to carry. I made something we could keep." A few days later, they married under the cottonwoods at the edge of the creek. No preacher came up from town, just a friend from the livery who read from a dog-eared Bible and nodded when they both said yes. Grace wore a ribbon in her hair, and Gideon held the ring Hayes had carved from antler with his own hands. The breeze carried the scent of sweetgrass, and the river ran quiet behind them. After the vows, Juliana leaned in and kissed Hayes firm and certain, her hand cupping the side of his face like she'd lived in that moment her whole life. He kissed her back with the kind of reverence that came not from longing, but from being found. They built the greenhouse together that spring, pane by pane, until it stood clear and proud beside the house. By midsummer, the first tomatoes hung heavy on the vine, and Grace declared the mint too strong. Gideon had taken to sleeping with his carving tools beneath his pillow, just in case he woke with an idea. Juliana began offering remedies to folks who came through a poultice for burns, a syrup for coughs. Hayes built shelves for her jars, labeled in her careful hand. He never said much when she worked, only fetched more water or added a log to the stove when the wind blew cold. One evening, as the sun dropped low and turned the fields amber, Juliana stood at the edge of the garden, her hands resting against her belly. Hayes stepped behind her, wrapping his arms around her waist. "You sure?" he asked, his voice low against her ear. She nodded. "I'm sure," He kissed her temple and let his hands settle where hers already were. Then we build another chair for the table. Years passed quiet and warm. The saloon never opened again. They let the building rest, and the land around it grew wild with sunflowers and rye. Grace took an interest in teaching, and by her 15th year, she'd begun schooling the younger children who lived up the North Road. Gideon learned to fix saddles and carve rifle stocks, and though he grew taller than his father by 16, he never left the valley. Juliana bore 2 more children, both boys, both loud as thunder. Hayes made them wooden horses and taught them to ride before they could walk steady. They never left the Bitterroot. They didn't need to. On clear evenings, when the porch was quiet and the day's work behind them, Juliana would sit with Hayes in the swing he'd built from the old saloon rafters. Sometimes she sang, just under her breath. Not loud, not anymore, not because she'd changed, but because she didn't have to raise her voice to be heard. Not here, not with him, and when she laughed, Hayes always looked up from whatever his hands were doing and smiled like the sound was sunlight. They lived all their years in love, surrounded by the life they built together, a life not born of ease but of choice, of staying, of listening, of building, and they never once let the lantern go out.